So for those who notice, I changed the title of the sermon. Originally, and I'm actually down and in our newsletter, it was called Rolling Over in My Grave, which was, something my parents would say to me all the time about what my actions were causing my grandparents to do. But I just thought through the course of events this week, I thought it just was not an appropriate title. So I've changed it to What is Family, which did change the tenor of the sermon a little bit. Last Sunday and again this morning at Adult Enrichment, I talked about Black Lives Matter. And I felt it just necessary for a moment to speak about what happened in Charleston, South Carolina this week, where a 21-year-old white man murdered 9 African Americans while they were at their Bible study. And so I'd like the names of those who were murdered to be spoken here. Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Tywanza Sanders, Reverend Daniel Simmons, and Myra Thompson. May our thoughts and prayers be with their loved ones. Some of their loved ones have actually publicly forgiven the man who committed these crimes. Sadly, I have to admit these people are far more spiritually advanced than I am. It's been interesting to see the media reaction to this. Fox News had the audacity to call this an attack on Christianity, but even mainstream media has focused on whether the person who shot these people is mentally ill, as opposed to whether this was a racist, terrorist attack. Now, I will not get into the question about whether just the mere act of killing another human being constitutes mental illness, because I think it may, but not from a legal standpoint. I look at a person's writings, actions, their intentions, and as well their outcomes. How did this killer identify himself? From what I have read, to date, it is clear he identified himself, how he expressed himself outwardly to the world by wearing the patches seen here of apartheid-era white supremacist governments of Rhodesia and South Africa. I read the statements he made about his victims, which identified himself as a white supremacist. And we need to recognize his actions for what they were. An act of domestic terrorism on our African American siblings. Now, how people identify themselves has been a large news item recently. We've had Rachel Dolezal, someone born of white parents who identified herself as African American, who was forced to resign her position as the head of the Spokane NAACP when the news of her parents came out. In an interview I saw with her on television, she said she identified as African American from the time she was a very young child. She went to a predominantly African American university. Her siblings were African American. She identified a man, not her biological father, as a father figure in her life. So we're talking a little bit about the way different families are created. So who am I to say what was in her heart and in her mind? There are some identities we are taught. There are some that we adopt to adapt to the society we live in. And we also live out an identity knowing how others will perceive us. I remember when I was in business, right? There was an expectation of a certain dress and decorum that was just expected. As a minister also, it's really no different. I am identified as a minister not only by my stole that I wear, but by my training, by my preparation, by my actions in the world, by the way I live my life, by the way I lead the congregation, by my daily interactions with each one of you. Through all of this, I live out and, in essence, create my identity. Now anyone can buy one of these stoles and get an online ordination. And so they may be perceived by the outside world looking in as a minister, but that does not make them a minister. So how we express ourselves to the world can be different than who we are. Now, I was always one of those out-of-the-box people in my experience in my previous career in the business world. I was, though, accepted sort of for who I was. I was called a radical, socialist, Jewish, Unitarian, liberal, commie, pinko, and that was just some of the nicer things they called me. But these same people, though, that I was fortunate to work with, they trusted me. And they knew me as a person of integrity, and that was the identity that they valued the most. Now, I didn't get invited to their country clubs for dinner parties, that's for certain. But I did get invited to every meeting where an important decision had to be made, and I was the person they trusted and turned to implement their decisions. And in some instances, actually, when they were having problems even dealing with their children or marital problems, they would call me for advice. I was a trusted advisor to these people. So there are some identities, right, that are inherent, actually, that we have and we live out, even though they're not part of maybe what is expected in the world. They're sometimes often hidden from the world, sometimes even hidden from ourselves as well, because we know, or at least we fear, the reaction we will receive from the outside world will be negative. Our identity is made up of many, many different parts, and when we can decompartmentalize all of those identities and live them out in the open as who we truly are, then we can find wholeness within ourselves. Now, I started off speaking about the 9 dead in Charleston. That received a lot of publicity this week. But there are another 9 dead people that have not received publicity that I would like to share their names with you. Mercedes Williamson, London Kiki Chanel, Christina Gomez Reinwald, Penny Proud, Taja de Jesus, Yasmin Vash Payne, Ty Underwood, Lamia Beer. Let us remember these names as well. From all across the country, these 9 were murdered in the United States in 2015 just for being transgender women. These are, of course, only the ones that we know about. And so, we need to remember their names and their stories. As AIDS activist Robin Podolsky wrote, and I quote, "I have to tell this story because my sisters are burning and my brothers are turning to ash. Those who fought most bravely, those turning into flame. I have to tell this story, so there will be descendants, so there will be honoring, and a thread to trace backwards, so we will not be lost again." End quote. So we have to tell these stories of transgender women often murdered by men in their lives, who live with fear, who live in a society that does not want to allow them to express who they are, which does not want them to live out their life in wholeness. And although our culture is changing slowly, it is still a struggle for so many. There's harassment and bullying in school, there are lost jobs due to bias, there's physical abuse, and as we know, there is murder. What can we do? Well, what we do in some instances, just like today, is to bring awareness to these issues, to provide a safe space for transgender people, to provide a safe place to talk about these issues, to provide a welcoming, loving, religious community we as a religion have stood at the forefront of this movement. Since 1970, when we as an association first issued a resolution to end discrimination against homosexuals and bisexuals, that was how it was worded then. By 1974, funding an Office of Gay Concerns, which changed its names over the years as our culture and awareness changed, including in 1996 when we included in its name, in its title, the word transgender. Almost 20 years ago. This is part of what our religion calls us to do. To speak up for the speechless, to stand up with the downfallen, to seek justice with the oppressed so that the interdependent web of existence can be made whole. And we do this with our actions, living out our values in the world. So the awareness of transgender issues has been heightened recently, of course, by Caitlyn Jenner, who was previously known as Bruce Jenner. That's what's on the cover of your order of service. Caitlyn Jenner very publicly shared her transition on TV and in Vanity Fair magazine. It was interesting to hear Caitlyn speak of her constantly denying what she felt inside, how that denial led her to want to affirm her masculinity through athletic achievement. Jenner does have an Iowa connection. Bruce Jenner went to Graceland College in southwest Iowa. I remember when Bruce Jenner actually won the decathlon in the Olympics. I had just graduated from high school. It was a pretty big deal, actually. He was on the Wheaties cover at the time, a box. You know, not everybody was on the Wheaties box. Cartoon characters sometimes also. But being the best in 10 events, maybe being proficient in many ways, was a foreshadowing of what was to come. And I have to admit, when I first heard about Caitlyn Jenner, I said, why did it have to be the Kardashians? They are quite successful business people in their own right, but their success has been largely based on their celebrity. And this transition from Bruce to Caitlyn will no doubt increase their celebrity and the celebrity culture of America. And there was actually tremendous backlash in the press from feminists about the pictorial in Vanity Fair. And some brought up issues of ageism and classism, and that it doesn't express the challenge that the majority of transgender people deal with. All of that is true. But it also brought the issue of gender identity into the forefront of the American consciousness. And despite whatever negatives Caitlyn brings out, due to these other people who complain, to me that is a positive that cannot be ignored. If nothing else, it starts the conversation that might otherwise never happen about gender. Now, I was fortunate in my young adulthood to have lived in Greenwich Village for approximately 3 years, where as a straight male, my sexual orientation was in the minority in the community. And I say fortunate because it allowed me to live with, work with, interact with people of very different sexual orientation and gender identities. And I learned, of course, that most of the people I met all had the same hopes and dreams about life as I did, searching for meaning and wholeness in life. And in that time of learning, I learned to become comfortable as well with my own sexuality. Of course, most of the world is not like Greenwich Village, let's be honest. And one of the differences today is that we now have new language to describe what I experienced then. I just had to sort of learn as I went along, sort of. And I think, there's confusion for many people. who struggle with the concept of transgender, and that is also to remember that there is a differentiation between sexual orientation and gender identity. You know, we say that at the beginning of every service, but I sometimes wonder, does everybody understand what we mean by that? So I thought I would share a little bit of what at least I understand that to be. Now, most people, when they think of gender, they think of male and female, right? You know, blue for boy, pink for girl, and about certain attributes of characteristics that may apply to one and the other. This is called the gender binary. But we know gender is much, much more complex than that. And so I bring you the gender-bred person here. Something I received in a training I just thought was really good. It talks about, as you see there, a gender continuum, which is about how you feel about yourself. So the head, right, is the identity, how you feel about yourself internally. Right? So, you know, transgender originally was meant not about having to do with sexual surgery at all. It was about, that was called, at least back in the day, transsexual. Transgender was about those people who felt different than the gender assigned to them at birth. And so they were on this continuum of gender identity. There's as well gender expression, which is how you express yourself to the world. That may be different than how you feel inside. Of course, there is, down by the genitalia area there is biological sex, what are the physical capacities we are born with, or we may have surgery to change. And then there is as well sexual orientation, which is who you are attracted to sexually. And everybody may be different across the different continuums. And to some degree, the attributes we place on a gender are culturally created, right? I remember when my boys came over from Korea, they were wrapped in pink blankets. Because in Korea, pink was assigned to boys and blue to girls. So it's purely a cultural thing that we do that. And Korean culture is just different than ours. And so that's just a very simple example, but so you can imagine, think about what you think about when you think of what is male or what is female. And think about how that is not either or, right? It can just go across a spectrum. And so the phrase you'll see here, this is sort of all the different continuums. There's a couple of added ones there. Affectional orientation is sometimes used to express who you love as opposed to who you are sexually attracted to. And the phrase cisgender, now that may be a new phrase for some of you. It was created to identify someone who identifies with the gender that they were born with or assigned to at birth. So I am a cisgendered man because I was born in a male body and I identify as a male. Those of us who are cisgender need to be allies to our transgendered siblings. And I use the phrase siblings purposefully, right? Because brother or sister, right, connotates a gender. And so somebody might be between genders, or multi-gender, pan-gender. There's many different phrases that are used. And we're all in different places along the continuum. And we have to do the work to understand where we are internally. So I like to think of the story of my aunt, she was a very staunch feminist. And so she was determined to raise her children in gender-bending ways. And so she insisted that her son take up cooking and ballet dancing, and her daughter play sports. Now, I am sure their lives are fuller because of that. But in the end, they ended up in fairly traditional societal attributes of their birth gender, with their daughter becoming a housewife, and the son loving sports and drinking beer. I guess that's my interpretation of traditional now. That's my own bias. But now that could have just been because they were rebelling against what their mother wanted. I don't know. But I do believe that we are who we are internally, and we need to know, right? We need to learn who that is, not just because someone else tells us this is what we should do. And we wish or we hope that our family accepts us for who we are. And sometimes people end up losing their families by finding themselves. I think of a quote from the movie Finding Forrester, where he says, and I quote, "Losing family obliges us to find our family. Not always the family that is our blood, but the family that can become our blood. And should we have the wisdom to open our door to this new family, we will find the wishes we once had for the parent who once guided us, or for the sibling who once inspired us." End quote. And so, what is it that makes a family? You know, I chose that opening reading because it didn't assign specific gender to the roles of the family. Caregiver, provider, teacher, defender, sustainer, inspirer. May we all be that for each other and for those that we love, whatever our gender may be. You know, sometimes we get so steeped in what our culture tells us is the truth that we have to strip away the veneer of what society tells us we should be, or what we should do, or how we should do it. We need to look at the world with wide open and curious minds, to stave off the conditioning and the marketing that we are just constantly subjected to. I have to believe that if the young man who shot those people in South Carolina, or the people who killed those transgender women, had a religious home and community that encouraged love, that encouraged peace, that encouraged deep reflection, then those people would be alive today. And that is what we are here for, to create a safe space, to explore the depth of meaning in our lives, and to share that with others for the betterment of the world. For if we do not act in a way that we internally know who we are, how can we ever have wholeness? And I believe internally, it's our universalist side. I believe that each of us are born with the seed of love, ready to bloom, if it's only water. And we can only do this with faith that we can learn to understand about ourselves, with a love that is open and trusting ourselves as well as others, and a nature of forgiveness, that when we make that awkward first step, or even multiple steps, and stumble, that we will be forgiven. Carl Jung wrote, and I quote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are," end quote. To find our authenticity, to follow that path, to know and to share our true self. The Reverend Richard Gilbert wrote, and I quote, "We are called by our conscience, called by our history, called by our own religious community, called by God, if you prefer, to be there in love and justice. How we name the source of our call should not be our primary concern. I am not worried about its theological geography, but its power and its authenticity." End quote. And so my question to all of you are, have you heard your call? And then I ask you, who are you called to be, and what are you called to do? And only by answering those questions can we all find wholeness. May it be so.